to Books Are Good Medicine, a podcast sponsored by the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community, featuring books and other Native American-focused teaching resources. We are your hosts, Allison Waka
and Odile Wood-Krieger. Today we have an Authors Talk episode for you with guest Debra Magpie Earling, who is known for writing stories of Native women who forged their own paths. We were fortunate to meet up with Debra while she was visiting Minnesota recently to promote her latest book, The Lost Journals of Sacajewea. We recorded this special episode on location at Open Book in Minneapolis and would like to extend a special thank you to Milkweed Editions, the publisher of Debra's books, for their hospitality.
Debra is also the author of Perma Red, a historical fiction novel about a young girl growing up on the Flathead Indian Reservation in western Montana in the 1940s. Debra is a retired professor who has received a National Endowment for Arts grant, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the Montana Book Award. She is a citizen of the Bitterroot Salish tribe in Montana.
In this episode, we discussed how Sakakawea is either completely erased from historical records or romanticized in a curated narrative. Debra shares what she thinks everyone should know about the real Sakajewea and how she envisions this book being used in classrooms. Listen to the end for a special surprise. Enjoy. Content warning. This book contains violence and other mature content, which we'll discuss in this episode.
So darkness doesn't kill the light, it defines it. So that's the first thing that I read when starting this book. And do you want to say a little bit about that?
Well, I think it's the launch into the story, which is such a Sacagawea story, and her story of her own discovery. And I thought her story is filled with light, and you can feel the darkness coming. And even, I thought when the darkness comes, it doesn't take away the light. It does define it. I thought it was just such a fitting epigram. So I put it on the book. And actually, the people at Milkweed were really happy with using that. They thought it kind of gave the story a direction. And I think it is a directive that even though this story enters like dark waters and becomes a difficult story for many reasons, I think there always is that light.
The one thing that, so we're talking to, I hope we're reaching some educators, and the one thing that I had when I was in elementary school was Sakajewea, right? I pretty much didn't have an identity as a Native kiddo within the school, right? But when, I think it was like third or fourth grade, and she was brought up, right? And she was a light to me then. So I really appreciate that connection because she brought some sort of pride to me all these years later, to this young, lost little girl in third grade, and I didn't really have any Native friends or just my sisters and my family, but, she was always a sense of pride that of course she knew the woods, of course she knew the world. And, so I really appreciate that connection because I think it really does bring some pride and light into the classroom for young Indian kids.
Thank you. I had no enlightenment about something. Nor did I appreciate the kind of powerful woman that she was. I saw her as a spearhead of manifest destiny. I saw her as a traitor. And I was terribly inferior to her identity and to her sovereignty as a woman and as an individual. So as I kept being called to this story, and my first introduction really to Sacajewea after the grade school experience, after Sacajewea is either sidelined in grade school stories, or she's the leader of, into what they refer to as wilderness. But it wasn't until I started sitting with the story that it really came to me. I was asked to write for Alvin Giuseppe. There was Lewis and Clark Through Indian Eyes, and we were supposed to tell the Salish story. I felt I didn't really do that great of a job with that. I wished I would have done more, but I really bucked against Lewis and Clark, the whole idea. And then, but one of the things that really stuck with me when I was doing the research, and I was on a panel during the bicentennial, I went to St. Louis, and I was on a panel with actually the distinguished and late Scott Momaday. And one of they had question and answers, and this woman stepped up to the podium, and she asked a very pointed question, and it was like, you had to write about the Salish, but as you were doing your research, what did you want to write about? And there was a story in the journals, and that just hit me, and it was the one that I wanted to write about. And it was in the dark winter of 1804. A woman was given to Sergeant Ordway, one of Meriwether Lewis's men, was given to him as a gift by a man, gave one of his wives, and she was one of his wives, and for the night. And apparently she liked him, or she didn't protest. And the man got jealous and stabbed and beat her. And so she ended up at the interpreter's campfire after she'd been stabbed and beaten. So Clark goes to try to mend ways, and even says, well, he had a right to kill her as his wife if he wanted to. But the whole time, it really drew me into the whole story of how the women's lives were unimportant. And I thought it wouldn't have been Charbonneau who was tending to this woman by the campfire. It would have been Sacajewea. And I thought that an almost invisible presence that's so present, that just locked me into her story. And when I sat down years later and they asked me to the Missoula Art Museum asked me to please come up with some response to the bicentennial, that was what came back to me. And it was that story, that remarkable story. And I sat down, and it was crazy. It was the most wonderful experience I've had as a writer. I sat down in a coffee shop, an old person's coffee shop, I call it, because they had soup. They had soup, and they had a lot of old people or regulars coming in, and the coffee wasn't very good, and bad coffee tastes like old teeth. And so I was in there drinking my coffee, and they said, please, whatever you want to write in response to these Native artists who'd done this incredible artwork. So I sat down, and the first thing that came to me was the Lost Journals of Sacajewea. And then I did a museum piece book with master printer Peter Koch, and we collaborated. He did the photographs, and he asked me for more stories. But the story that always haunted me was Sacagawea's story,
So this podcast comes out of Understand Native Minnesota's narrative change campaign. And this multi-year $5 million campaign is really about how do we make content about Native Americans more obvious, more prevalent, and the things that we wanted to be shared. And so I admire your bravery, for one. You've tackled a really hard topic, but also someone who is either completely erased or has a completely false narrative because there was nothing about her. And when there is an absence of knowledge, people just fill in what they think is appropriate. And I think that's definitely the case of probably your school experience. I grew up in Canada, so I didn't learn about Sacagawea. She wasn't part of my curriculum. So I'm really curious, what do you want people to know? Like, what is the prevailing narrative that we should be telling about Sacagawea? What have you learned about her?
That's a really good question, and I feel like you've only scratched the surface. That her story goes on, certainly long after the Corps, and non-Native historians have written, white historians and Ambrose, and a lot of very powerful national award-winning writers or they're nationally acclaimed writers and historians have claimed that she died in, what was it, when at the age of 23 in I think it was Fort Manuel, died of putrid fever. And that was recorded by Clark. But all the Native people that I know, including people in my own tribe, tell stories about Sacagawea going on. Like she lived on the Wind River Reservation. She actually was able to escape Charbonneau. And I think if there's one thing to take away from this story, and I love that there's a mythology, there's the wrong mythology around Sacagawea, but perhaps the most interesting mythology is that there's one where, she died at 23, and there's another where she lived to be almost 90. There's this mythology of this great presence that would not go away, that could not be silenced. Even though she had to silence herself along that journey, she had to stay silent. The story that I'd like people to take away is that she became a sovereign woman. The Hidatsis claim her as their own, and they have their own story about her. And the Lemhi Shoshone claim her. I believe that when she returned, because Lewis and Clark were not or Ordway were not creative men, they were scientists and they were smart men, but they weren't creative. And they talked about how she responded to the Lemhi Shoshone, and it was an overwhelming response. When she saw Camille White, she could not, her brother, and she was supposed to procure horses for them. She could not stop crying. She could not stop crying. And I felt like all of that trauma and the stress that she'd experienced as a young girl was she finally felt safe enough to just weep. And it's such a powerful and moving story. But I think the takeaway is when her husband, the man who was supposed to be her husband, that her father had betrothed her to before she came of age, refused to marry her because she had had a baby by a man who had raped her by Charbonneau. So he refused her. So she had no real place with her people anymore. But what I loved about her was she dusted herself off and she said, I think she spoke English at this point because she made it very clear. I am going to see the ocean. I want to see the whales. And she got on that horse and she left the Lemhi Shoshone and she became a sovereign woman. She is a woman who defined herself in history. And this is who I am. And I love that for Native women. This is like, we are powerful. And though we have traditions that may define us, we also have agency and we define ourselves and our place. And if there's any takeaway, it's the power of individuals to define their lives against all tragedy, against all circumstances. And I think Sacagawea certainly is a light, a great light toward that. And I hope that when young women particularly read this, they see the power that she had. I don't believe that she just went along with these men, and she knew the power. She knew how to make poison. She knew how to do things that would make you sick. I don't believe she let these men just have their way with her. There was some part where she had to be acquiescent in order to survive and to order to keep her child alive. But there's also this great beauty in all of the things that she knew. And if you read the journals about their suffering, it doesn't talk about her being bothered by mosquitoes. And I thought she knew how to protect herself. And
yes.
so that would be not just with Sacajewea, but let's look again at the stories of our people. Mm-hmm. And let's look at, we've been told this history, and I think we need to sit with that history again and just begin to interview, like our ancestors are always with us and alive. Ask them, what happened? Why was this the way that it was? That doesn't make sense. Tell me what happened, and they will. They'll tell you.
Our grandmothers, it really just kind of reminds me of any grandmother. And I get to a point where now I am lucky enough in my age that I can appreciate having so many aunties and grandmothers, and and knowing that they don't have to be the direct, the non-native thought against family lineage, right? I have so many that aren't my, blood, but they are my blood. And so even though we don't share that, typical DNA sequence, or it still is. And I think that's one thing that Native women can relate to with this book, is that we all see her, we can see her as a grandmother, as an auntie. And so it kind of brings to mind, and this might be just the side note, but my what popped into my head when you were saying that was, recently my son is really into superheroes, right? Like Iron Man and Spider-Man. And he said, who is your favorite superhero? And the first thing that came to my mind was Nana. My mom, his Nana. And he's like, oh, she can be mine too. And it just the idea that we are now kind of I feel like there's this light that is coming now with this generation, that we are able to make and bring back our own stories, and they may be a little different, but they are our stories, right? And I think this is just a beautiful book that you really encompass some really I really connected to the way that you wrote certain things, and especially one that, and I'll just really quickly say it, but it's with the wind. I listen to wind if he growls or whistles. And I just felt, so we always have this really big conversation that wind is this one thing in the universe that we can't really catch, and we can't really, it's this one real free thing in the universe. And I just love how you gave it felt like another character in the book. And if you want to maybe explain your writing process or your thoughts on how you created an identity even for wind here, that I think is a new idea to some people, maybe not us, but like to others that may be reading your book.
Thank you, Allison. Well, I think that's a very sensitive reading of the Lost Journals of Sacajewea. Everything, I had to reorient myself in many ways when, as a writer and writing in, one of I think Joy Harjo called it writing in the enemy's language. But I thought about the ways in which, there's things that she would have revered. So they had to be capitalized, but it makes for a really difficult read when you go through, it makes you stop, on trees and wind and, the things that she begins to see and hold and take with her. So there were many things that were, important and had influence in her life. The white man, she always calls him, that's always Cap, the first white man that she meets. She just refers to him, that's kind of his name. But white men or white men was capped, and until she heard what they were calling women and how they were denigrating women, and they became diminutive white men. Like after that, they no longer held that respect for her. So I tried to really think about what it meant to live at that time, which wasn't that long ago, and it's still in the breaths of our parents. Our grandparents will talk about these days. They have remembrances from their family, and in the West, it's just such a brief time, really, that my great grandmother lived in a teepee, like knew people that my ancestors knew things that they lived often in teepees. They had their own homes, but they lived in a teepee, and that's in the living breath. And so I tried to sit with that story and think, okay, there was a different sensibility about the world that I had to sit with. And one of them was liver shine. Pulling a liver, and I haven't done that, but I remember my husband running up with a liver, and he's white, but he showed me this liver that he had pulled from this deer that he killed, and how beautiful that was, and how beautiful it is to eat that liver fresh from the deer. But I thought about that whole sensibility, like when the buffalo would cross the river and they'd drop through the ice, and then they would bloat, and they'd come down the river, these big bloated, they must have been huge, these huge buffalo and they actually described the meat as bottle green. Like bottle green meat, and some of the men were getting sick from the smell, the gaseous fumes of this. But I loved it. The Hidatsis and the Mandas were riding down to the river and pulling them out and eating them. This flesh was so soft, and they said it just tasted so delicious to them. And I was thinking, well, your calories are right there. You don't have to kill this animal; it's already dead. And you have this meat that's soft and probably sweet. And what was that like to put to rethink that and to place yourself in another time where all of these things had a different meaning and different beauty to the people who are experiencing that. And I think, I don't think heart-wise or anything, people changed much, but I think with, we've become refined in our tastes,
So I'm curious about the section right at the very start of the book. You have the Dear Reader section, which is an amazing sort of primer for what you're getting into. You have the double beat of the ellipses, to represent her heartbeat in the pause. You talk about the capitalization. You talk about the language, and I don't want to say broken language, because I think it was when English is not your first language, you process things different, and that's not wrong. So the way that the language appears is different. You've had some things that are faded. So you've given readers this primer, right? Like you're entering into something that is really different than anything else you've read. And as a former classroom teacher, people always say to me, oh, well, just recommend a Native book, because they want a book that talks about culture. But this is one that is so inherently culture filled and culture rich. And I want to thank you for that. But then I'm curious, did you want to sort of give away those secrets, or did the editor say, people aren't going to non-Native people aren't going to know what to do with this? I'm curious, how did that come about?
I don't know what was up with me on that, because, I did have an editor who said, Lauren Langston Klein, she said, I believe that you need some kind of introduction to this book. And at first I really balked against it, because I thought, dear reader, there was kind of it's
kind of Bridgerton.
This is going to be a tough book. I I really backed against it. And one of the reasons that I did was I really felt an affiliation and an alignment with Sacajewea. And I thought nobody gave her a primer to read, to understand what she was heading into, how she was going to survive. And there was really an inclination in me to just throw the reader into this world that isn't their own. And I think like those caps and the faded words are things that she feels she can't say aloud. They're sacred to her, or they become imbued with deep meaning. So she doesn't feel she has the right to say these words. So she whispers them or says them as reverentially as she can. But there's like a thought, I'm not being very nice to the reader. There was this point when I thought, do writers always have to be nice to readers? Do we always have to explain it? It's certainly not something that I'm sorry, like white male writers don't have to do that. Like they can throw you into the morass or whatever. They can throw you in anywhere. And there's no little, dear reader, this is tough. But I acquiesce, because one of the things I did want it to come across is that I couldn't use ellipses. I kept trying to I thought that doesn't work. And I thought like it would be always the drum beat or the heartbeat that would be the pause, or the heartbeat would move faster and faster. And I thought about those old Kroger, the old anthropologists, when they sent their plebes out to gather the stories from Native people. They told them, if they repeat, this repetition, this is just nonsense, or this doesn't need repeating, so cut it. But in Native stories, when you tell a story and you say, the woman went down to the river, and it's like the woman just went down to the river. When you say it twice, the woman went down to the river, then maybe there's a issue there that you should be paying attention to. If you say it 3 times, there's really pay attention. If you say it 4 times, it is entered the sacred. So I wanted to get across that idea without breaking any boundaries, but the heartbeat. So it will go boom, 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 boom. And the novel enters into another place that she doesn't really understand, or she's in awe of. So trying to gather that, through trying to gather those kinds of moments swirl it into writing, make it accessible to people in that way. I thought, I don't want to bar people from understanding this. It's not my desire to be a white male writer who is writing something lofty and above other people. I wanted people to enter this world with reverence and hopefully understanding. So when you have a drum beat and you hear that, what I love about white people, white people in powwows, they'll go, that drum beat. They're drawn in. They really understand, because it's a universal language. It's our footsteps on the earth. It's our heartbeat. It's our calling. And so when you enter the drum circle, you hear it and it calls you home, it doesn't matter what color your skin is, where you grew up. It really calls to everyone. And one of my favorite things to do is go to the powwow and watch people who have never been to a powwow, and they come and they're like, they have that moment. And what a wonderful thing that is. And I hope that is like with the Lost Journals of Sacajewea, that I've had so many people say, such a hard book, I stopped reading it. And then they said, well, I decided I'll pick it up again. And once they let go of like their own preconceived notions of how they should read the book, they said they understood it. Once they just let the story carry them. I love that idea. I had no idea that it'd have that impact, but.
Well, I do find that some books are hard for me to read. There has been, and I think this is coming into the classroom too. I recently had a teacher bring this up, and that how do we support Native kids within the classroom, that some reads are going to be hard for us to digest, right? And I've had that with some novels where there was one part where I wasn't emotional, like I didn't want to cry or anything, but I just had this like wash or wave of like sad, like I had to disconnect from the novel. Like I've had there was a long-standing book club here, and we read a lot of Native authors, and some of them I would, but this I really didn't feel that. I felt maybe that I was, it really did carry that culture within, so I didn't feel so targeted, or maybe and so it might be for non-natives more of a harder read, just because it really doesn't come. But for like myself, it wasn't. There was this one part that I can't remember what page it was on, but I work with a lot of non-native folks, right? And in like my daytime job. And there was this part where I correct me if I'm wrong, but it said something like, and they brought no gifts. And I was like, yes, because here I am trying to teach folks, if you want to work with a Native community or tribe, you need to bring. And I was like, I just like was so happy that he said, I was like, this is a long-standing tradition that there was this, I felt connected, here we are from even, back then to now. I'm still going through, and they brought no gifts, and that's going to carry with me now and through my work, and maybe I'll just print it and put it in my office. But it really was, I felt connected to her and these things that I think we go through in society now and in this world, and how do we operate? How do we now navigate this combination and our next generation? And so this was a great read, I think. And what would you say you were always? Well, let me ask you that. Do you think you were always a storyteller, or how did you were speaking of your mom a little bit earlier, and I feel like it's in your blood a little bit, but how does that how does your identity come with storytelling?
I feel like Richard Wagamese, right? He's like, all we are is story. And I love that you had his quote in the beginning, because he is one of my favorites. Yeah. And similarly, I was, how have you always been filled with story?
And I believe this really strongly. I taught storytelling at the University of Montana. Started out as a Native American literature class, and I had one student who was non-Native who came up to me, and he already had an MFA from the University of Iowa. They didn't even accept me at the University of Iowa, but he came up and he'd been in the writing program there. And he goes, I thought you were going to teach more, I thought you were going to teach you stories, actually. I'm kind of disappointed. I just got out of Cornell, and I was teaching some Derridian boring stuff. Really, it was like theoretical. In some ways, I think for me, I don't say this for theorists, but for me, it was kind of nonsense, but it was what I was trained to do. And then when he said that, I just remember looking out at my class and pulling back from the podium, and then understanding that I'd always been taught through stories, and I've learned to be ashamed of that in some ways. Like some of my colleagues even said, well, you're not just telling stories, are you? Like there had to be some kind of theoretical component to it. And I thought, there is a theoretical component to it. If someone tells you a story, if an elder tells you a story, you have an event in your life, something even maybe catastrophic happens to you, an elder will say, oh, and they'll tell you a story and you'll think, what does that mean? Like, what does that even mean? And they'll say, you'll know.
Mm-hmm.
And then over the course of your life, that story will begin to morph and change and grow and fill your life with knowledge. And it's like the elder is a witness to your life and stays with you through all those times. Like they'll tell you a story of their own hardship, or they'll tell you an old story, but they don't say, here's how you solve your problem. I've never had an elder do that. But they will just lend that support of stories. Since I was a small child, I've been a storyteller. My mother used to say I talk too much because I would go to people in the grocery store. She was always worried that somebody was gonna run off with me, but I just talked people's ear off. I was like, "What's in your grocery cart? Why are you buying that?" And then I'd tell them stories about my mom. I would tell stories. I remember my mother. This is like to my mother's mortification. There was a woman who used to remember they had the Avon calling.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
My mom was going, oh, here's that woman, Avon, calling again. So she goes, I'm going to go hide. So she was hiding in the bedroom. And she goes, just tell him I'm not here. So my sister opens the door. And then she said, oh, this woman, no, my mother's not home. And I go, yes, she is. She's in there. She's hiding from you. And the reason why she's hiding is she doesn't want to buy your products anymore. I'm like, my mom, wow, did I get walloped after that? But I couldn't stop telling. Like if somebody don't like that, I tell my husband, do not tell me a story and tell me that I can't repeat it. Like, because he'll tell me, now promise me you won't say this story. And I'll go, yeah. But I can't help it. I'm like, I'm sorry. I just love stories so much. And I'm probably a horrible gossip. But not maybe even in a mean-spirited way sometimes. Because I believe that if you're not part of in your community, if people aren't gossiping about you, then nobody's talking about you. Like you're not part of the thing. And somebody always has something to say about, well, did you know? And I love it. I think it's fascinating. I don't want to hear about people going off on vacation and having a blast. They just had a ball. I want to hear their stories. I'm always fascinated with stories. I don't think it's mean, even if they're going through hardships or they're having difficulty in their lives. I'm fascinated with that. I want to hear, and she did something really stupid or he behaved this way. And I love that. I just can't help myself. So I think however stories come to you, they're powerful.
So we are winding down on our time, but I do have one final question that I would love for you to weigh in on.
Okay.
And we've talked about the challenges of this being like some hard content and things like that. Mm-hmm. But I know that you are a professor, or at least formerly were a professor. How do you envision this being part of a classroom? Do you see it utilized in K-12 education?
You know what? I would hope that it would be. There are words that would be censored, and I'm not for censorship. And so, but I think that the idea to have students sit with history and to begin to investigate and ask questions and to really think about, like, read history, as a grand story that it is. And if you look at these journals, and as I sat with Sacajewea, and some of the questions that availed themselves to me, and I told this story earlier, but Lewis and Clark were behaving. They were sacrilegious to many of the items that they were seeing in the land that they were passing through. And they were in some ways like chided for it by the land itself when they pitched their lodge beneath a great pine tree and it exploded. The only tree in the whole forest around them that exploded in fire and just was a fireball over them. Flames came down on their lodge for doing what they were doing, and still they didn't get it. And so if there's, for children of a certain age, for, especially high school students, to sit with the story and say, what is really here? we need to look at history more deeply.
Mm-hmm.
We need to question. And I love the idea that there would be young people who would consider this story and ask their own questions.
Mm-hmm.
And may this be only the beginning of our understanding of Sacagawea's life.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
I wanted to gift you with some wonderful Minnesota wild rice. It is white earth, and if you talk to anybody here, they'll say white earth is the best. You know, you may have some contentious conversation with other folks.
Yes,
it's a little bit of a competition.
It is, very much so.
But thank you for feeding our spirits. I wanted to feed your body and your mind, and I'm just so grateful for this conversation and being able to get to know you better.
You've gifted me in so many ways today. Thank you. I'm honored to be invited into this community and into this sisterhood in Minneapolis and Minnesota. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. To wrap up, we have a special announcement. Milkweed Edition has generously provided copies of both Debra's book, Perma Red, and the Lost Journals of Sacajewea to 5 lucky listeners. To enter the giveaway, email us at info@booksaregoodmedicine.com with the subject line, Debra Magpie Earling Giveaway, by July 15th. We will randomly select 5 winners and notify them via email. Good luck, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Books Are Good Medicine. Subscribe to our channel on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also visit our website, booksaregoodmedicine.com, to find episodes and resources or to send us a comment. This podcast is sponsored by the Shakopee, Madawakan Sioux community and produced by Goff Public. Our theme song is Stomp Dance by Blue Dog. The opinions expressed on the Books Are Good Medicine podcast by its co-hosts and guests are their own in their personal capacities and do not necessarily reflect the views of any organization with whom they are affiliated or with the podcast's sponsor.